Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? I think you can. So, my name is Loukas Ziomas. I'm a partner with McKinsey and Company, based out of our Middle East office, and a core member of our energy practices in the Middle East, but also in Greece and the Southeastern Mediterranean. I think the vast majority of the speakers, also being the theme of the conference, talked about the transition. Transition is a very big word. There is an even bigger one called orderly transition. And I'm here to talk about how oil and gas, which is at the epicenter of this debate, is going to continue playing a very important role in what we call an orderly transition, and not just a transition. Now, that being a McKinsey and Company presentation, it will have many slides and many numbers, so brace yourselves. A few months ago, actually almost 4 months ago, the conference about climate change in Dubai, called the infamous COP28, took place. And it was one of the COPs that I think will actually go down in history. There are very few COPs that have happened up until now that remained very relevant. I think people know two of them, Kyoto and Paris. They were very famous and remain very famous because they actually forced the world to set targets around the climate debate. I think COP28 will remain in history because it was the first COP that actually forced the debate towards action. It forced the debate towards action, and it also included oil and gas companies into this action suite. The most important commitment that took place at COP28 was what we call the Oil and Gas Decarbonization Charter. This was the first bold attempt of the oil and gas industry to commit to very specific decarbonization targets. Namely, 52 oil and gas companies endorsed the charter, more than 40% of global oil production, a very important KPI, 60% of endorsers are coming from countries that have NOCs and not IOCs, national oil companies, big oil producers of a national nature, more than 30 countries represented of all continents, including Asia and Southeast Asia with large populations. And finally, the companies committed to a target of more than 2 gigatons of CO2 reduction in the next 6 years. This is approximately 3 to 5% of global emissions. It's a huge number. This happened in the midst of a very peculiar energy landscape. It actually has accelerators and decelerators of the debate. What we saw in 2022 is many commitments around funding of energy transition projects, acceleration of carbon technologies, commitments of industrial players across the board, record investments, and at the same time, commitments of Scope 1 and 2 overall in regards to CO2 reduction to continue across the board. But at the same time, with the war in Ukraine, we actually saw some decelerators, important decelerators. One, there is an increasing discussion about what the role of fossil fuels is going to be in the system. We're going to talk more about that in the coming slides. The second thing is it's the first time in many years, more than a decade, that renewable costs start increasing. We saw a lot around offshore wind, and wind more broadly around costs increasing. Now, surprise, surprise, coal is a very important part of the mix and remains a very important part of the mix. We actually saw all-time high demand in 2022 in coal, which sounds counterintuitive, but it's not. And finally, there are major pipeline challenges for some of the complex energy transition projects, like the ones around CCUS and hydrogen. They're very nice on paper, but in reality, when you deploy the CapEx is challenging, the plans are challenging. Now, taking all of that into account and looking at what do we need to remember in regards to the role of fossil fuels in the transition for the next 25, 30 years. 6 things. One, we don't just focus on decarbonization anymore. This used to be the theme. They are asking me to actually go down because maybe I'm too tall. So on the one hand, we saw a complete change on how we see the transition, how we look at the transition. The focus the last few years has been on decarbonization, decarbonization, decarbonization. Now we're shifting towards energy security and affordability. The second thing is We've seen like tons of scenarios around the world in regards to what's going to happen with fossil fuels in the mix. IEA has scenarios, IPCC has scenarios, we have scenarios, everyone has scenarios. Now, if we look at those scenarios and distill them, the bottom line is that fossil fuels are going to continue playing a very important role in the mix towards 2050. A very, very important role. Their actual share is going to be ranging from 25% to 45% of final energy consumption, which is a very big share. Now, the actual decline around oil will be driven by road transportation and aviation, primarily, as well as chemicals. In gas, it will be primarily power generation. And at the same time, we need to recognize that it's extremely important to go around some major bottlenecks in order to deploy mega projects in the transition, primarily around infrastructure. Finally, oil and gas has made a very important first step in COP28. It has committed to very bold decarbonization targets, but this is not enough for the 1.5 degree. Many more things need to happen around the more challenging levers to decline the actual CO2 emissions, and at the same time, these need to happen in a short duration. They need to mature in the next few years. So let's go and look at these points in a little bit more specificity. One, scenarios. I talked about scenarios a lot. Scenarios are important because they allow us to understand how the actual system will evolve in the next few years. As McKinsey, we analyzed 5 of them. From right to left, from a world of a fading momentum, a world that stops caring that much about CO2 and focuses more on economics, to a world that actually tries to focus on the 1.5 degree trajectory. One side of the spectrum, the other side of the spectrum. The commitment of the global community in COPs is around the left, which is a very challenging commitment. But this is the pathway that the world has actually set, and we need to figure out ways to achieve that pathway in an economic way that allows both for affordability as well as security. Now, in all of these scenarios, all of them, from fading momentum to 1.5 degree and net zero 2050, we actually have a very important role of oil and gas. If you can see the numbers here, and I actually warned you there will be many numbers, the actual share of oil and gas on the right is more than 45%. On the left, when we have a 1.5 degree trajectory, I highlighted 1.5 net zero is 25%. In both sides of the spectrum, oil and gas continues to play a very important role in the mix. For oil specifically, if we look at the different scenarios, what are the drivers? The drivers are primarily what's going to be happening with this infamous evolution of EVs in road transportation, what's going to be happening with aviation and new fuels in aviation, because thermodynamics are ruthless there, so we need fuels that can actually be used in planes, like SAF, and what's going to be happening in chemicals, especially in the context of massive and very rapidly rising middle classes in Asia and Southeast Asia. In all the scenarios, as you can see, even in the net zero scenario, we actually have approximately 23 million barrels of oil per day required in the system in 2050. Now, this raises a very important question. Do we have enough oil and gas today to cover this? Are there enough resources? Do we produce enough? How will supply and demand match? Now, on top, you see many beautiful colors. These are all the demand scenarios. And in gray, light gray and dark gray, you see all the supply scenarios. Now, as you can see, even in the most aggressive scenarios, the net zero scenario 2050, there is a gap between supply and demand. And this gap is actually based on the fact that the oil and gas industry requires continuous investments in order to keep supply where it is today. It is extremely important to recognize that in order for us to have the gray supply, light gray and dark gray, the system will need to continue investing. It will need to continue investing in producing more hydrocarbons, and it will need to continue investing in producing the most carbon-abated hydrocarbons, the most efficient in terms of CO2 footprint. We talked a lot about oil. The bottom line is oil is going to be a very important part of the mix. We will need it up until 2050 in any scenario. What's happening with gas? Gas has been referred to by pretty much every single person that was on these panels today. And it was there because, indeed, gas remains extremely resilient towards 2050. In any scenario, from fading momentum down to achieving commitments or 1.5 degrees, gas has a very important role to play in electricity generation, in buildings, as well as in industry. The primary reason that it has to play such an important role is, first and foremost, we have many economies in the East that do not have the ability to scale up renewable sources as well as transmission and distribution at the scale that is required for gas not to play a role. And two, it acts as a balancing mechanism in the system. And it will continue to act as a major balancing mechanism in the system because we don't have alternative technologies that can play that role in an efficient and effective way. So gas, very relevant up until 2050. Most probably, we're going to be close to 3,000 BCM by 2050. Within gas, and if we double-click on the delivery mechanisms of gas, the most important driver is LNG. And LNG will actually not just continue playing a very important role, but it will actually increase its importance in the gas mix. It will go from 15% of the gas mix to 20 to 22% of the gas mix. And it will not only play an important role in terms of absolute numbers and volumes, but it will play a very important role in terms of pricing because it acts as the marginal gas molecule around the world. It is the molecule that sets gas prices in pretty much every country around the world. Now, all of this is beautiful, and of course, in order for us to actually get close to any of the scenarios that I just presented, we will need to invest extensively in energy transition technologies, either that being wind, solar, green hydrogen, heat pumps, or electric vehicles, those being the most important 5. Now, all of them are facing challenges in terms of existing infrastructure. The two areas where most of the focus will need to be in the next few years in order for these technologies to be deployed efficiently and to actually help the system achieve targets close to 1.5 degrees and to the 1.5 degree scenario are materials, especially heating wind as well as green hydrogen and electric vehicles. We just don't have enough at this point in order to achieve the scale-up that is required for those technologies. And 2, infrastructure. The speakers talked a lot about hydrogen, talked a lot about CCUS. These are very nice technologies. They offer deep decarbonization options. However, they require new infrastructure that does not exist today. At the same time, we always need to look at this from a regional perspective. I think we're in a luxurious position in Europe talking about infrastructure when we already have a very well-developed and deployed transmission and distribution infrastructure across the board. This is not the case for most of the countries that will be driving demand towards 2050. I'm talking about countries in South Asia and Southeast Asia, where most of the population will be growing. Now, last but not least, this COP28 and the broader debate brought oil and gas companies to the table for the first time. There was a huge debate around what oil and gas companies can do in order to accelerate the transition, what they should do in terms of supply, but also how they can help the demand side of things, how we consume, up until when we consume, what technologies are we using as consumers. And because they were in the spotlight, the debate opened up, and there was, as I said in the beginning, a very, very important and bold commitment around decarbonization of the oil and gas supply that we have around the world from every single corner of the world. Now, this decarbonization journey has one substance in the center, and that substance is methane. Is this methane natural gas that we use to produce electricity, to use in our homes? This same substance is actually one of the biggest contributors of climate change in the world. Why? Because methane has a very high GWP, as we call it, greenhouse warming potential, versus CO2. It actually has 80 times more CO2 intensity than CO2 itself when it's emitted in the atmosphere, either that being via venting or flaring or via leaks and fugitive emissions. Now, recognizing that, the debate in the oil and gas space was, how can we tackle methane first? It's something that we can monetize, something that can produce value for us, and we should put it in the front of the decarbonization journey. And this is exactly what happened. 45% of CO2 emissions that are coming from the oil and gas industry are methane related. So the industry has put very bold targets to almost eliminate methane emissions, fugitive emissions, by 2030. Now, is that enough? No, it's not. The oil and gas industry emits 5.1 gigatons of CO2. This is 10% of the global emissions by this year. I mean, on a steady state, this is 2023 numbers. And tackling methane and all of the commitments of COP28 will actually allow us to reduce that 5.1 by approximately 40%. But there are more technologies like electrification, carbon capture and storage, as well as hydrogen, that need to come into the equation. They need to become much more economical, from 50 tons or $600 dollars per ton right now to less than 50 in order for us to achieve this journey. So the oil and gas industry has committed. It will play a very important role, but there is more to be done. Thank you very much.